In this session, Michael Hagenlocher, who is from the United Nations University located in Bonn, and he will talk about understanding and managing systemic risk, lesson learned from COVID-19. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, evening, and morning, depending on from where you join us, colleagues and friends. And a warm welcome from my side to this workshop as well. Super interesting discussions, and I'm very much looking forward to the continued debate. I would like to use the next minutes to really reflect a little bit on lessons from the ongoing pandemic, on understanding and managing the complex and systemic nature of risks. I think over the last, over the last 2 years, we've all experienced firsthand that this pandemic is and has been far more than a health crisis, and that it really has affected societies and entire economies to their core. What is interesting to see is that if you look at the risks associated with the pandemic, that the direct risks and impacts are mostly related to human health and the functioning and capacities of health systems or the collapse of health systems. But interestingly, it's notably the restriction measures. And here I'm not talking about wearing masks or physical distancing or vaccinations, but I'm referring more to the lockdowns that we've seen, the curfews, the travel restrictions, the school and business closures that have really led to further cascading effects on interconnected social, economic, and financial systems across scales and borders, affecting the entire planet. And adding to this complexity, in many regions, these effects have been further exacerbated by the concurrence of natural hazards. I'll show a couple of examples later on, conflicts, but also ongoing humanitarian crises that exacerbate the impacts that we've seen. The question is, in light of risk often being understood and viewed as, let's go to a place and look at what are the elements that are exposed to a specific hazard and what are maybe their vulnerabilities towards that hazard. What does this complexity mean for our understanding of risk? And what does this maybe understanding, this new complex view on risk mean for managing risks when they're increasingly interconnected? In order to find answers to those questions, we've taken a multi-method approach, reviewing the literature, and a lot of my previous speakers, their work has been part of this. So really to try to build a conceptual understanding, what do we mean by systemic risk? Because this concept has been influenced by different schools of thought, by different groups. And we wanted to see, is there some sort of convergence, or are there still some rifts even within the systemic risk community of how systemic risk is conceptualized? We've also consulted key experts on this and done consultations in case studies, to do concept development, but then also to test and apply the conceptual model with the aim to come up with a final conceptual model that helps us to grasp the complexity of the systemic nature of risks associated with COVID, but also to identify lessons for conceptualizing risk and lessons for risk management, and ultimately derive policy recommendations. Maybe a few words about the case studies. So we've tried to, because effects are highly context specific and are felt very differently and manifest quite differently in different parts of the world, we've tried to really deep dive into different case studies, including urban contexts. So for example, we've looked into effects of COVID in Guayaquil in Ecuador, a densely populated, one of the most overcrowded urban settings in Latin America, high dependency on income, imports and exports from the port, so linkages to the global market, to global market systems. We've looked at the maritime region in Togo, an interesting case because it's quite rural, but it also features the capital of the region, the city of Lomé, is characterized by agricultural livelihoods, high dependency in terms of food security on local produce, high levels of poverty, high rural-urban, pre-existing to the pandemic already, rural-urban linkages, but also national, international linkages in terms of trades, but also, for example, in terms of remittance flows that were interrupted by COVID. And interestingly, at least officially, very low number of reported cases, but quite widespread impacts. We've also looked at a fragile setting. So we've worked with experts and stakeholders in Cox's Bazar, the world's largest refugee camp. I think it's clear that this is a highly fragile setting, characterized by high dependency on the hosts, but also the international community. We've geographically quite close, also tried to look at how did COVID affect the Indian Sundarbans. There we put a specific lens on a multi-hazard perspective, because we've seen last year how a quite severe cyclone has hit the region amidst the pandemic. And we were looking at what does this mean in terms of interconnected effects, risks, but also how does that challenge risk management and maybe conflicting paradigms and policies on how to deal with those risks individually. And we've looked at Indonesia. So here we really tried to have a national scale perspective where we saw challenges on all fronts. So effects, interconnected effects across sectors and systems, including collapsing health systems, disrupted trade networks and supply chains, effects on national debt, which then led to decisions of the government to postpone development plans and development targets as well. But also how COVID effects and policies to deal with COVID have conflicted with emergency response to multiple other hazards that the country has been confronted with over the past 2 years. I can't talk about, due to the shortness of time, talk about the detailed findings from each case study, but we're about to publish a report on these findings where these will be featured in more detail. But I can maybe try to reflect on a couple of cross-cutting findings from the cases. First, and I think that's something that has been highlighted by all the previous speakers, is that we really saw that COVID-19, but also, and most notably, the interventions had clear and observable cascading effects throughout nearly all of society, which then also raises questions on how do we deal with those risks? Doesn't that require a whole of society approach? Secondly, that COVID-19 and the interventions have really reinforced pre-existing vulnerabilities. An example, for example, in Togo, we've seen how the curfew that was imposed by the government has led to the closure of night markets, quite heavily dominated by informal livelihoods, leading to loss of income and loss of livelihood opportunities for the most vulnerable and the poor. Just to give you one example, but also this, what I mentioned before, this dependency on global networks and processes that then have manifested in significant impacts at the local level. Again, the Guayaquil, for example, in Ecuador, where we saw that the slowdown in international trade and the disruption of supply chains have also led to job losses and economic downturn throughout the entire city, but especially also in the informal sector. COVID-19 and impacts on women and girls. Here, I just want to highlight briefly that I think this is also maybe the right moment to talk about the role of women's leadership, because we know that a lot of frontline workers are women, and they're not only key to help societies maneuver through this pandemic, but also they've been much more exposed to the virus. And secondly, they are often, and more often than men, at least in our case studies, working in jobs where they're exposed to a lot of social contexts, which also then means that their livelihoods were much more affected by the restrictions put in place by the government to fight the pandemic. I don't want to speak about all the reported cases of domestic violence, violence against children, and we've in at least 3 out of the 5 countries also seen an increase in child labor. and child marriage. So quite significant effects as a result of these knock-on or ripple effects of the pandemic, often linked to questions of household income and poverty. We've tried to summarize, and I know that this looks very messy, we've tried to summarize the complexity of our findings in a conceptual model. It starts with pre-existing vulnerabilities. In this case, when we talk about the direct risks and impacts of COVID on health and health systems, the vulnerabilities of COVID-19 risk groups, so these are the elderlies, but also our health systems. And then when COVID came, and maybe this was compounded with other hazards, we've seen these effects on health, mortality, morbidity, and collapsing health systems, which has reinforced the pandemic by an acceleration of the number of cases, but also reinforced existing vulnerabilities. And as a response early on in the pandemic, governments have, and still today we're doing this, it's a quite dynamic process, have put in place interventions, as the before mentioned interventions, lockdowns, et cetera, which then have, coupled with the existing vulnerabilities, the pre-existing vulnerabilities of the general population and entire sectors and systems and agents, led to adverse cascading effects on social systems, on education systems, on economic systems, and through global dependencies, not only in places that were affected by the hazard by COVID as such, but also, for example, if you look at places like Tonga or Tuvalu or Kings Island, small islands, for example, barely any COVID cases registered, but through their dependency on international tourism and the restriction measures in terms of travel restrictions, being labor force, livelihoods, and GDP in those countries being heavily affected indirectly by COVID-19. Trying to reflect a little bit on the characteristics, and here I can only echo what Pia has mentioned before, and I think it also mirrors exactly what they've already highlighted in their previous publications, that the systemic nature of risks associated with COVID-19 is characterized by high interdependence and interconnections of systems and cascading effects across those systems and borders and scales, very nonlinear relationships that we see in the pandemic as such, but also in this, I don't want to say cause-effect structure, because I think we need to be critical about that. I think that's also what Pia mentioned before. But in the effects, feedback loops, I talked about reinforcing infections, but also, for example, we saw how the pandemic has reinforced pre-existing migration dynamics from rural to urban areas in Togo, or reinforcing existing inequalities. On the question of tipping points, I'm curious to continue that debate with the previous speakers. We would say that we've seen a number of tipping points as well, be it the collapse of health systems that has really led to a regime shift in Indonesia, or be it social unrest that we've seen in Guayaquil in Ecuador. And another characteristic that many of these risks are actually highly under the radar or unnoticed. And this then is a manifest, for example, in the underpreparedness that is very obvious for such events, but also in, for example, pre-existing societal distrust, and how then COVID has exacerbated this. This is then maybe also the place to talk about values and norms and belief systems, and has now manifested in what we're seeing almost weekly in the news in terms of demonstrations against COVID measures, et cetera, and of course, all of this being characterized by very high dynamics and very high uncertainty, which also then poses questions of what does that mean in terms of decision-making under uncertainty? How has COVID then expanded our understanding of risk? And here, this is just to show that actually we think that COVID has really illuminated that we need to move from this looking and knowing risk as hazard by hazard, what's flood risk in place A, who is exposed, who is vulnerable, to a much more systemic lens on looking at and understanding risks. And here I want to highlight 3 lessons, and we've used deliberate choice, the IPCC framework for this, because it's at least in our community, so the risk reduction, climate change adaptation community that comes strongly from environmental hazards and climate change, we use this framework a lot when we talk about understanding risk. And here I want to highlight three main learnings. First, on hazards and shocks. So we need to understand that hazards and shocks are nothing that only emerge from outside the system. It's again the question of, I find it interesting how you define the system, right? But also from within the system, and that there can be these secondary hazards that are socially or even politically constructed. So in the case of COVID, for example, we clearly see the shock propagation as a result of the interventions in response to the virus. Then secondly, on the concept of exposure, if you look at the definitions by UNDR or the IPCC, it's always framed as an element that is located in an area that is prone to a hazard. But here we really think that we need to also much more look into these indirect exposures through interconnectedness of agents and systems. Again, this example of places, small islands that were not affected by the disease, but by the travel restrictions and were exposed due to their interdependence on a global tourism industry and network. And lastly, then in terms of vulnerabilities that we really, and this has been said before, we need to move from looking at single vulnerabilities towards individual hazards, towards multiple vulnerabilities of different interconnected systems that can also reinforce each other. And I think here the pandemic has shown how vulnerability of one system can turn into a shock or hazard to other systems. And combined, that leads me to four, I mean, maybe we have a few more, but I would try to stick to four today, four key implications for risk management. So first, I think, and this is maybe not so new, we think that risk cannot be eliminated from systems, but rather must be managed, monitored, and treated regularly. Here I also want to come back to a point that was mentioned earlier on risk thresholds. I think it was in the talk from Stefan. So what is actually acceptable for whom and for different elements in the system? And what are then trade-offs and what are risk transfer mechanisms? We have very high uncertainty in the shock element. But the interesting thing is when we talk about risk, we often move to looking at vulnerabilities. When we talk about risk management and adaptation, there is a natural tendency to focus on the hazard. We say that I think we should focus on the risk mitigating agents. We need to reduce susceptibilities. We need to strengthen coping and adaptive capacities. Else there is a quite high risk that next year will be in another wave if we just continue to respond to the virus and might see another lockdown. So we need to tackle the underlying root causes of the vulnerability of the systems. And then, of course, if our risks are interconnected, that also means that we need to look at network structure and systems vulnerability and reciprocity much more closely. And lastly, we need to address this dynamic aspect of risk, but also the responses. So here to look into pathways that enable managing future risks using an all hazards and multi-risk approach through a constant and iterative process of learning and adaptation. And I want to close by coming back to what Beck said. I think now also with the new IPCC report published in August last year, I think we can really say we live in a risk society. And the question is, how do we live with these risks? And I think here is time to not only talk about systemic risks, but also to talk about how can we deal with this risk landscape in a process of constant recovery. Let's also talk about systemic recovery and systemic hope. And I would leave it there and thank my co-authors at this stage, but also you for listening. And I'm available for questions, at least for a few more minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.